The American umbrella is folding. The front line in Ukraine shifted a few kilometers in early February. Russia's MOD released operational summaries. Reuters reported it with the obligatory unverified claims disclaimer. Social media recycled Putin's 2024 vampire speech and called it breaking news. And nobody, and I mean nobody, noticed what actually changed. The real movement wasn't on the map. It was in the room where Europeans stopped pretending the American umbrella still covers everyone equally. Here's the thing about recycled rhetoric. You're going to hear the parasites and vampire ball language on repeat right now. Vladimir Putin said it in March 2024. The Kremlin transcript is public. It's real. And yes, it's making the rounds again because it fits the current mood cycle. But here's why this matters. And it's not because Putin just got metaphorically spicier. The recycling itself is the signal. When old threat language gets new distribution, it's not because villains got creative. It's because the conditions that made that language ring true have gotten worse. When you start hearing the same warnings twice, you're not seeing repetition, you're seeing acceleration. Think of it this way. If your doctor tells you your blood pressure is high in January and again in March, the second time isn't news. The news is that nothing got better. That's the Putin vampire line right now. It's not that Moscow said something new. It's that Europe got more vulnerable to hearing it. Now, the detractors will say,
"Come on, that's just propaganda recycling. It's meaningless noise."
fair point. Surface level, yes. But zoom out 3 frames and watch what actually happens while people are distracted by the rhetoric. The real story lives on the ground in Zaporizhzhia. Russia's claimed incremental territorial gains there. Reuters couldn't independently verify because reporters aren't embedded in active fronts, and Ukraine has every reason not to broadcast manpower shortages. But here's what matters. Every small, contested gains in the south matter structurally. Not because Russia is winning in some movie trailer sense. Not because Ukraine is collapsing. The battlefield, it's a horrific meat grinder. That's clear. But Zaporizhzhia does something different. It forces a choice. If Russia can keep pressure on that sector, Ukraine's manpower gets strained harder. Training pipelines get thinner, supply decisions get uglier, and every month of that grind pushes a question up the chain to NATO. How long are we doing this? And what does commitment actually mean? That's not hysteria, that's logistics math. And that's where the real mutation of the alliance starts to show. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently started using a phrase you should pay attention to: coalition of the willing. Listen to what that actually means. The old NATO framing was one for all for one, just like the Musketeers. Unified command, collective defense, Article 5, the whole legitimizing structure. A coalition of the willing is a different animal. It's layers. Layer 1, US nuclear backdrop and strategic capital, increasingly uncertain under political pressure. Layer 2, UK, France, and whoever else wants to commit conventional muscle to a potential European security arrangement. Layer 3, the rest of Europe probably hedging. That's not unity, that's contingency planning in public. Now, the detractors will say,
"You're reading tea leaves. NATO's fine. Stop catastrophizing."
maybe. But here's the thing about alliances. They don't collapse because someone cut the ribbon. They collapse because the players started calculating exit costs instead of collective gain. And when your leadership starts talking about coalitions instead of the alliance, that calculation has already started. Here's where it gets structural. This is where the throne framework, the 6-tier power analysis that I use, actually illuminates what's happening instead of just commenting on headlines. You've got Tier 3, politics and diplomacy cracking. That's the NATO structure. The agreements, the rules-based order everyone talks about. Rutte's coalition language is Tier 3 acknowledging that Tier 1, the conceptual worldview that the West is unified, is starting to fray. But Tier 3 doesn't control outcomes. Tier 4 does. Tier 4 is money, resources, supply chains, the economy. Who prints currency? Who pays the bill? And that's where the EU rearmaments narrative actually lives. The European Commission and national capitals are announcing the 800 billion rearm Europe figure. It sounds massive. It sounds serious. And on paper, yes, the money exists. But here's the brutal part. Money without production capacity is just expensive air. The EU doesn't have munitions factories running at wartime velocity. It doesn't have the vendor relationship, the supply chain density, or the institutional culture to scale defense spending the way Russia has forced itself to do. Russia accepted economic pain and retooled society. Europe is trying to retrofit rearmament onto a comfort economy. Those are two different things. And then there is the layer that almost nobody talks about on mainstream mainstream platforms. Sanctions enforcement. Specifically, what happens when sanctions become a domestic security problem. On February 2, 2026, German authorities arrested 5 people accused of exporting advanced technology to Russian arms firms. Thousands of shipments, tens of millions in value, all while the EU was politically announcing sanctions extensions. This is not sanctions don't work theater. This is sanctions work, but they're a kinetic problem now. Every sanctions regime has leakage. Every embargo has smugglers. That's expected. But when you're getting arrests at that scale, you're not looking at petty crime. You're looking at organized networks, vendor capture, institutional penetration. That means the sanctions enforcement apparatus has become a counterintelligence and organized crime problem. It's a proxy war inside Europe's own supply chains. The detractors will say,
5 arrests? That's nothing. Sanctions are pointless.
and they're not entirely wrong, but they're missing the structural point. Those arrests are the visible tip of enforcement. The real cost isn't the arrests, it's the attention and resources now diverted to catching smuggling networks instead of growing production. Every hour a German investigator spends chasing tech smugglers is an hour not spent on something else. Every regulatory friction point added to prevent sanctions evasion slows down the rearmament timeline. So let's connect the dots. You've got Tier 3 cracking, NATO structure mutating into coalitions of the willing. Tier 4 constraint, money exists but production capacity and supply chain integrity are the real ceiling. Tier 5 being weaponized, sanctions enforcement is draining attention and resources from rearmament. And Tier 6, the battlefield in Zaporizhzhia, pushing all the Tier 3 questions forward faster. None of this is the alliance is dead, of course. None of this is Europe is doomed. What it is a system in transition under pressure, showing the seams. Here's what you need to understand about alliances under stress. They don't break because the enemy is strong. They break because the members start calculating individual survival before collective interest. And right now, individual European countries, France, Germany, Poland, are all running separate calculations on what a post-American security architecture looks like. That's not panic, that's prudence. But it's also not unity. And war does not reward divided houses. The uncomfortable reality nobody on a Brussels podium will say out loud is, Europe is not militarily weak because it lacks will. Europe is weak because it lacks time. Russia accepted the pain of reorientation. Europe is still negotiating whether to accept the pain. Meanwhile, Zaporizhzhia keeps grinding, sanctions keep leaking, and the NATO consensus keeps fracturing into coalitions. If you're paying attention to the headlines, you're missing the story. If you're watching the alliance politics, you're watching the future. If you want to see how power actually moves instead of how it looks on TV, hit subscribe. This is how we cut through the noise. So here's the pattern. When an alliance stops talking about unity and starts talking about coalitions, it's not reforming. It's calculating its way toward a different arrangement. When sanctions enforcement become a domestic intelligence problem, the sanctions regime is working, but it's creating new friction that slows adaptation. When a secondary front like Zaporizhzhia becomes strategically important not because of tactical gains but because it forces manpower choices, the war has entered a phase where attrition logic replaces victory fantasies. And when a NATO secretary starts acknowledging backup plans in public, the backup plan is already being put behind closed doors. That's not pessimism, that's pattern recognition. The real question isn't whether NATO survives, it's what NATO becomes in the next 18 months when the US political calculation shifts, European money tightens, and Russia keeps pressure on sectors that force choice after choice. Next week, what happens when an American security guarantee becomes conditional instead of categorical? Because we're getting very close to finding out. This is a wrap for today. I'll see you next week.